Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. I look back now and realize that in a lot of ways, I was miserable during some of the best moments of my life. I wasn't happy. I was stressed. Here comes the embarrassment express. I wouldn't do that again for any amount of money. He had the biggest sitcom on American television, 4 Emmys, a Golden Globe, and the title of highest paid actor on TV for 4 straight years. So why did Jim Parsons just admit, at 53, that he was miserable through most of it? Not stressed for a season or nervous for an episode. Miserable during what everybody assumed were the best years of his life. He says he wouldn't live that way again for any amount of money. But the real story here isn't the sitcom. It's what was happening underneath it the entire time. And it started long before Sheldon Cooper ever existed. A confession 13 years in the making. In a July 2026 appearance on the podcast All Out with John Dean, Jim said something he'd never quite put this plainly before. Looking back at some of his career's biggest highs, he realized he'd actually been unhappy inside them. Not nervous, not tired, unhappy. He described feeling like he had a dozen plates spinning in the air at once, convinced that if a single one dropped, everything he'd built would come crashing down with it. From the outside, people called that disciplined work ethic the mark of a serious professional. Jim now calls it something closer to obsession, a compulsive need to control every possible outcome because some part of him didn't trust that good things could just happen without a fight. The interview stood out for another reason too. Host John Dean, also openly gay, spent much of the conversation trading notes with Jim on what it costs to build a public career while managing a private self. And Jim didn't dodge any of it, calling the overworking what it really was, a kind of OCD-driven need to check items off an internal list just to feel safe enough to do his job, one he now doubts was ever actually necessary. He admitted that even across 12 seasons and 279 episodes, he never stopped feeling like the most nervous person on set, still bracing before every take that he'd blank on his lines, a fear that never matched the calm, buttoned-up image audiences saw on screen. He said the pattern cost him real years of his life, moments with people he loved that he simply wasn't present for because part of his mind was somewhere else, running risk calculations. This wasn't a one-off comment either. He's returned to it more than once this year, each time with a little more detail, which raises an obvious question. What happens to someone's mind after 12 years of quietly bracing for loss, even while the entire world keeps telling them they've already won? To understand where that fear actually came from, you have to go back to 2001, years before Sheldon Cooper existed, to the day that permanently changed Jim's relationship with time. 6 years was the number he couldn't shake. On April 29, 2001, Jim's father, Milton Parsons, died in a car accident at 52. Jim was 28, still years from booking Big Bang Theory, still going out for parts he wouldn't land. His father had run a plumbing company in Houston and had gone off the road alone, later discovered by a passing driver. Jim wouldn't land his breakout role for another 6 years, meaning his father never saw any of it, not the Emmys, not the Golden Globe, not a single episode of the show that would make his son a household name. Years later, on the TV special Hollywood Medium, Jim revisited the loss on camera and was told something that seemed to genuinely bring him some peace, that no faster response that day would have changed how things ended. Whatever comfort that offered, it didn't erase the math he'd already started running in his head. That math became unavoidable in 2018, with Big Bang Theory still one of the most watched shows on the planet. Jim was 46, exactly 6 years younger than his father had been when he died. So he asked himself the question most people spend a lifetime avoiding. If he had 6 years left, would he really spend another one playing Sheldon Cooper? The answer was no. Not because he'd stopped loving the role, but because he needed to find out what else was out there before his own 6 years ran out. He took that reasoning to the show's producers, Chuck Lorre and Steve Molaro, before he ever brought it up with the people he'd stood next to on camera for 12 years. His own castmates were blindsided. Kaylee Cuoco has said the news left her so shaken she could barely breathe. Johnny Galecki has said he felt ambushed, not by the decision itself, but by learning about it without warning, and has since said the whole thing could have been handled with more care. Jim's father never got any say in how his own story ended. Jim made sure he'd get to have one. But leaving Big Bang Theory didn't close the book on loss in his life. 6 years later, on a completely different set, grief found him again in a way that's almost hard to believe. A death on a Hulu set that echoed his own words. In 2025, Jim joined the Hulu comedy Mid-Century Modern alongside Nathan Lane, Matt Bomer, and the legendary Linda Lavin. Loosely inspired by the Golden Girls, the show followed three gay friends who move in together in Palm Springs, with Lavin playing the sharp-tongued mother of Nathan Lane's character. By every account, she was adored on that set by everyone, cast and crew alike, described by the show's own creators as universally loved in a way that felt personal rather than professional. Then, on December 29, 2024, with only 3 episodes left to shoot, Lavin died suddenly at 87 following a fast-moving lung cancer diagnosis nobody had time to fully process. The creators faced an impossible call: recast her, quietly write her out, or address it head-on. Before she died, Lavin had reportedly made her wishes clear herself, telling the writers not to shy away from the truth if something happened to her. They chose to write her real death directly into the story, and what they used still gives people chills. In her final moments, being driven to the hospital by her husband, Lavin had grabbed his hand and told him she loved him in case it was the end. The writers put that near verbatim into the show, spoken by her character to her television son, in an episode the creators later called terrifying to write. Hulu gave the cast and crew an extra week off before filming resumed. Jim was there working alongside Matt Bomer just weeks after Lavin's actual death, performing grief that wasn't scripted at all underneath grief that was on a schedule that gave everyone barely any time to process before cameras rolled again. It's the kind of moment that never makes it into a highlight reel or an acceptance speech, but it stayed with him. And it wasn't the first time Jim had to keep working while carrying something enormous. Years earlier, near the very end of Big Bang Theory, loss found him in a way that nearly broke him. A dog, an injury, and a cliff. The final season of Big Bang Theory should have been one long celebration. Instead, it became one of the hardest stretches of Jim's life. As filming wound down, one of his dogs was nearing the end, and Jim and his husband Todd made the agonizing call to let him go at home rather than risk him dying alone at a vet's office while Jim was at work. Days later, while the world geared up for months of farewell specials and cast tributes marking the end of a beloved show, Jim injured himself on stage. He's since described that stretch as the scariest few days of his life, comparing it to standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down into something genuinely dark, all while millions of viewers tuned in weekly to laugh at Sheldon's quirks with no idea what the actor behind him was carrying. It's worth remembering this wasn't a one-time dip in confidence. Even years into playing the same role, and later on Broadway in front of live audiences, he said the fear of blanking on his lines never fully left, making him, by his own account, the most nervous person in nearly any room he worked in. There's a strange kind of loneliness in being watched by millions while going through something you can't explain to any of them. This wasn't the first time Jim had learned to bury pain under a performance either. Long before Hollywood knew his name, he'd already spent years perfecting that skill for an entirely different reason. The closet he built before anyone in Hollywood knew his name. Growing up in a Houston suburb, the son of a plumbing company president and a schoolteacher, Jim acted in school plays from first grade through senior year, a passion he never fully shook even when he tried to. At one point, convinced acting was too impractical to chase, he quit for a year, planning to finish a business degree instead like a sensible person. Watching his actor friends rehearse, plus encouragement from Todd Spiewak, then his boyfriend, pulled him back in. The two of them moved to Los Angeles together so Jim could pursue acting properly, and he went on to earn a master's in classical theater from the University of San Diego. But underneath all that ambition sat a fear that had nothing to do with career risk. Jim spent years terrified of being outed as gay. That fear didn't fade in adulthood, and it didn't fade when he moved to New York to chase an acting career. He said even the sight of a pride parade used to unsettle him, because he knew people around him held hateful views about exactly who he was. So he avoided gay-friendly neighborhoods entirely just to stay unnoticed, choosing ordinary city blocks over any risk of being seen for who he actually loved. He and Todd were together roughly 10 years before Jim came out publicly, just days after a Big Bang Theory season finale aired. He said meeting Todd was the real reason he finally had that conversation with his family, because Todd mattered too much to keep hidden. Jim genuinely feared the announcement would hurt his career, maybe even cost him the show. At a time when leading men on major network sitcoms almost never came out publicly, especially ones playing characters beloved by a broad, not always progressive, mainstream audience. Instead, the opposite happened. He said becoming part of a community that still faces open hostility gave him a strength he didn't expect, and if anything, it helped his career rather than hurting it. Even before that, the couple had quietly been honored for who they were, invited to a respected California awards ceremony that recognized them as an inspirational gay couple years before marriage equality existed nationwide. Jim has said he never fully understood being framed that way, insisting he never saw his relationship with Todd as a statement or a piece of activism, just an ordinary life built on ordinary love. He and Todd married in 2017 after roughly 15 years together, and Jim has described their daily life since as almost deliberately unremarkable, full of the same routines as any other marriage. But even after building a full life with the person he loves, and even after finally being honest with the world about who he is, Jim still couldn't outrun the thing that had been shaping him since he was 28. The role money could never buy back. Nearly every reflection Jim has offered in 2026 circles back to the same idea: time. He said flatly there's no amount of money that would get him to return to the version of himself from Big Bang Theory's biggest years, the constantly overworked version, always bracing for failure. He's called it a self-tortured stretch of his life, valuable in hindsight, but not one he'd choose to relive. That's an unusual thing to hear from someone who reached the exact level of success most actors never come close to. For Emmys, a Golden Globe, a Tony nomination years later for the play Mother Play, a run in Our Town, and earlier Broadway credits in The Normal Heart, Harvey, An Act of God, and The Boys in the Band, a role he later reprised on screen. It's easy to forget now how close he came to never getting any of it. Before Big Bang Theory, Jim auditioned for roughly 30 different roles and watched pilot after pilot get rejected by the network once he'd actually booked the part. He even read for the American version of The Office around the same era, though it didn't pan out, and he since admitted he privately assumed the whole premise was a bad idea. A British import Americans surely wouldn't want, a prediction that turned out spectacularly wrong. When he finally read for Sheldon Cooper, the pull was immediate, strong enough that he skipped a party the night before his audition just to keep working his lines. His first read was so strong that producer Chuck Lorre reportedly assumed it had to be a fluke and brought him back a second time, just to confirm it wasn't beginner's luck. It wasn't. There's a fitting irony in the fact that the man who played television's most famous fictional scientist actually failed science in school himself, something he's chalked up to only wanting to study meteorology because he grew up in hurricane country, not out of any real interest in the science behind it. His years spent directing and executive producing young Sheldon trace back to a conversation between Jim and Todd about Jim's own nephew, an unusually sharp and different kind of kid, an idea Jim eventually pitched to Chuck Lorre without expecting much to come of it. Between 2015 and 2018, Forbes named him the highest-paid actor on American television, a title that makes his earlier decade of rejected pilots almost unrecognizable in hindsight. Even with the director's credit to his name, Jim has said he still sees himself as fundamentally an in-front-of-the-camera person, someone who's never quite felt at home behind the scenes. These days, he's on Broadway nightly in the Celine Dion-scored musical parody Titanic, playing the ship's doomed captain. On paper, it looks like a man who has everything. In his own words, some of his best years were spent quietly falling apart while everyone around him assumed he was thriving. So, what actually shifted? What finally let him stop treating his own success like a threat instead of something he'd actually earned? 53, and no longer afraid of the mirror. At this year's Tony Awards, Jim showed up without any of the flashy, glamorous looks people associate with his current Titanic run, and admitted something almost nobody expected. He sometimes worries fans who remember him as Sheldon will be disappointed by how much older he looks now. He started the role at 34. He's 53 now, 1 year older than his father ever got to be. When John Dean pointed that out to him directly on the podcast, Jim called it bonus time. Not a throwaway line, but an actual belief he's since built his life around. In a strange twist that same July, right as his most candid interview in years was spreading online, a completely fabricated report claiming Jim had died went viral, racking up close to 1 million reactions on social media before his representatives had to publicly confirm he was alive and well, telling outlets he'd simply joined the long list of celebrities victimized by internet death hoaxes. For a few days, people online were genuinely mourning a man who was, at that exact moment, quietly telling the world the opposite, that he finally understood how limited his actual time was and intended to use it differently going forward. He said he has nothing left to prove professionally, that he only wants work that brings him joy because he's fully aware nobody actually knows how much time they have left. Even now, decades into performing, he's admitted he still walks into every show fighting the same old fear of blanking in front of a live audience, a nervousness that apparently never fully disappears no matter how experienced you get. He's also been clear that no matter what's offered, he has zero interest in putting Sheldon's cardigan back on for any kind of reboot or revival. That single fact, the one that shaped him at 28, that pushed him off Big Bang Theory at 46, that sat beside him on a grieving film set at 52, is still the quiet engine behind everything he does at 53. The tragedy here was never really the sitcom ending or the awards or the fame. It was a man spending decades treating survival like a countdown clock, right up until he finally decided to stop running from it. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you knew exactly how much time you had left, would you still be living the way you are right now? If this one landed for you, like it, comment, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.